You're listening to Jay's Analysis, integrating film, philosophy, geopolitics, literature, history, economics, intrigue, and espionage, only at JaysAnalysis.com. And now, Jay's Analysis Podcast, with your host, Jay Dyer. Doing out there? It's been a couple weeks. I apologize that we haven't had a Jay's Analysis talk, but I have been super uber duper busy with doing speaking and lecturing, and now we're back for this subscribers podcast for Jay's Analysis. We have been going through a cult series with James, as you guys know, and then I've also been working through Plato, so look for Book 5 of Plato next as we move through those books. And James and I tonight are going to move on to the subject of Heaven's Gate. Now, we're not going to retread too much of the facts of Heaven's Gate because we just did an Esoteric Hollywood episode concerning Heaven's Gate that gets into a lot of that, and that will be available to the public. But for Jay's Analysis subscribers, we're going to get deeper into the philosophy. We won't have any commercial breaks, so we'll be free to hear James's wisdom as he drops them knowledge bombs on us. So if you would, James, just for a little bit here, I'm sure plenty of the listeners to the podcast will not have the opportunity to perhaps hear all of the Esoteric Hollywood episodes. So if you could, let's get a little bit of background. We don't have to do too much on Heaven's Gate, and then into some of the philosophy behind this and how maybe it affects us today.
Sure. Heaven's Gate basically began, even though it wasn't named such in the beginning, around 1973, a man named Marshall Herff Applewhite, who had just divorced his wife, or she him, because he had been carrying on affairs with other men, so he was bisexual. He met a woman, a nurse at a Houston hospital named Nettles. And I keep wanting to call her Betty, but isn't it, forget her first name, Bonnie.
Bonnie, it's Bonnie, yeah.
Yeah, Bonnie Lou Nettles and Herff Applewhite. They met in Houston, and they both, Bonnie Lou Nettles, her marriage was falling apart. She always had occult interests. Herff Applewhite was more of a straight-laced kind of, even though he was interested in science fiction and esotericism his whole life, he was more of a doctrinaire Protestant Christian. His father was a Presbyterian minister. He attended seminary.
Right.
But in 1973, they were two basically losers, for lack of a better word, who were not able to fit into society in any sustainable way. So they meet in 1973 and strike up this friendship. Inseparable they are. And both of their families were like, oh, wow, they're going to have a relationship. But they never ended up doing that, even though Bonnie seemed to be interested in Herff. It wasn't reciprocated. But they both latched onto each other because they loved the New Age stuff, and they wanted to tie it to Christianity in some way that made sense in a holistic way. And so what they did was they began to study the Bible together, and they lit upon the verse in Revelations 11, which talks about the two, which many patristic writers have said, oh, that may be the Elijah and Moses. It may just be some two of the followers of Christ in the later days. But in Revelation 11, it talks about the two who will be murdered and then will be raised up 3.5 days later, and then they'll be sort of beamed up to the cloud in the sky. So Herff and Bonnie both took this to be a UFO, which was going to beam them up and take them off of the earth after people had killed them. And they had risen up and proved them all wrong. Well, you shouldn't have killed me. And the whole underpinning of this was, the way that they integrated the New Age with it is they said, well, we are sort of in an animal evolutionary phase, semi-animals, and we need to rise up to the next level by denying human weakness. And so for Herff Applewhite, I believe this was just his guilt and his self-loathing over, his bisexuality, the fact that his wife basically caught him in an affair, his relationships hadn't worked out with his male friend he lived with, and even other women he had relationships with. Bonnie Nettles was not Mother of the Year by any stretch, and just basically abandoned her family and did not feel right in conventional society. So they had every reason to say, why are our lives so screwed up, and why are we always constantly thinking about New Age Christianity? And so they brought it all together and made it work for themselves in saying it's our special mission to overcome the human level of evolution by just denying, sexual urges, by minimizing the food urges, and by sort of excising all human emotion from their lives. And so they started this religion. What they did is they got on the road in a car and just drove around the United States randomly, and just to see what happened. And it's a very American thing, right? I mean,
yeah, it is, right? Yeah.
You think anyone in any other country, you just says, let's get in the car and just start driving. Of course, the Franciscans did do that, actually, although they didn't have cars. They're like, let's just walk in a straight line down that road and see what happens. So, hey, maybe I'm being too hasty here. But nonetheless, what ended up happening to Herf and Bonnie is, Herf was hearing voices from the beginning. And Bonnie, one of the things that attracted Herf, or attracted Bonnie to Herf, was that she is the first person that said, no, those voices have to be some kind of higher level talking to you. It's not that you're schizophrenic, it's not that you're crazy, it's that you're special. So thus begins the Odyssey. And what happens is that they got up to 100 followers by just going to college campuses and different New Age bookstores and putting up flyers.
Yeah.
And we all know what happens eventually, but just to get there kind of in a quick scene-by-scene way, what happens is, in the late 70s, 2 of the members get an inheritance so they can afford to live in posh mansions or at least apartments. And then in the mid-80s, Bonnie dies of cancer. And this is a blow because Herf and Bonnie had formulated a theology which said, look, we are already sort of part of this new evolutionary level. This sort of higher level soul or presence has cohabited our own earthly souls and overshadows it, so that we don't think in terms of human anymore. And because of that, a UFO is going to come at an undetermined time. We're going to get on it and lay down in a comatose-like state in our current bodies, and then we'll be given new bodies, and we'll just kind of flow into them. Well, when Bonnie died of cancer, that kind of threw a monkey wrench in that theology, because you weren't supposed to die. So Herf took this very badly.
Right. They were actually saying that the body would go into the next level of evolution. You would take it with you.
Oh, sure. This called for something else, and Herf said, well, what we have to do now is we have to believe that there is going to be an end. We are all going to die. We don't know how yet. He hadn't necessarily settled upon suicide yet. But he said, dying is going to be part of it, whether someone kills us or we do it ourselves. And then what's going to happen is the UFO will come by, it'll take our dead bodies, we'll stay here. And they don't have to be on the ship anymore. They can just stay here on Earth, and then our spirits will go into the new bodies that are waiting for us on the ship, and we'll be crew members on a UFO to do all this wonderful research, throughout all eternity. So we all know what happens next, the end of it all. The tragic March 26, 1997 is when the bodies were discovered of 39, including Herf Applewhite. 39 members of Heaven's Gate were found dead, having committed suicide. Two more would commit suicide over the next months, leading the total to 41 people, I think. Mm-hmm. So this is what we're dealing with here, is what were these people thinking? What is this?
Well, let me ask just a couple things in my note, too, is that I want to point out some of the patterns that you've discovered in your research of the cults. And the patterns that we've talked about as we've done Nation of Islam, Jim Jones, and Scientology, and now Heaven's Gate, is exotheology, which is the idea of the astral deities and some sort of tying it into, ancient mythology and planetary rulership and so forth. New Age elements of Christianity, scientism and evolution, as well as the classic techniques of gaslighting, strict, generally speaking, communalism, communitarianism, except for, I guess, the fact of the Nation of Islam did promote starting your own business. But for the rest of these cults, it's pretty Marxist, I guess you could say, pretty communitarian.
Uh-huh.
We have the idea of leaving completely your previous identity, taking on a new name, the movement towards androgyny, sexual strictures, right? That the idea that you have to be perfected, so there's this unattainable status, right, that allows for the psychological mechanism of attributing guilt to anyone who cannot attain to this impossible scenario. And the irony, of course, is that for all this androgyny, it was Applewhite who himself was homosexual. So what I want to ask you about as we get deeper into the philosophy of this is something I've been thinking about lately is my own sort of thesis about the UFO alien phenomenon, which I did mention to you privately. And this is that there seems to be different theories as to what exactly is going on with all this, UFOs and aliens and all that. And people have pointed out the similarities to ritual abuse, people that have undergone ritual abuse by cults, and how they do seem to mirror the descriptors of people who've gone through supposed abduction scenarios. And so they ranges everything from people are completely making it up, to that it's a complete government fabrication, to that there really are extraterrestrial entities that are visiting and spiriting away people in the night, to it being government psyops, it's fake, it's a cover for secret technology, to it being demonic, right? And so I'm kind of thinking that maybe I have a thesis that explains all of them. And I had a period in my life when I was young where I did have a bad acid trip that in ways paralleled a kind of abduction scenario. I am not saying I was abducted by aliens. I wasn't. But the issues of time displacement, torturing coming from the environment in that psychic sense. I don't mean psychic, but you know what I mean in terms of the psyche.
Right.
The idea of things happening in reverse, all these things were features of my own bad LSD experience. And as I read stories of abductees who appear to have either made up elements of this from their readings of different science fiction stories, in the case of George Adamski, one of the first abductees, to the possibility that we know that in MK Ultra, if you read John Marx's book on the Manchurian Candidate, that there were a series of experiments where the CIA and the military-industrial complex would actually dose people with LSD unwittingly. This happened on many instances. In fact, there was, I believe, a former flop house owned by mobsters that was bought by the CIA for this very situation, and they would secretly dose people who were coming to the whores, and then they would be tripping balls, going crazy, right? And if you've never done LSD and then someone were to sneak this on you and not knowing much about it, you would literally think that you had been taken to another dimension, and most likely you would think about there being aliens, right? So in other words, what I'm saying is that I could see a very easy way to create a psychological operation where you could organize scenarios where perhaps people had been kind of prepped through pop culture or neuro-linguistic programming or something like that to believe that aliens were real. And if they were already predisposed to that ideology, if you dosed them with LSD and then threw in a few stage props or engineered some sort of situation where they could easily be thinking that they had been abducted, and at the same time in their mind they actually are interacting with interdimensional entities, because that is what often happens in the LSD experience. You do talk to something on the other side. Whether that's demonic or whether it's a manifestation of your own mind is up for debate. But I wonder if the alien phenomena could not just be a social engineering / psyop tool that could easily be done through something like MK Ultra, mind control experiments, but blended with the alien mythos. And after a while, after you get enough enough people who've probably legitimately experienced something, then you have a new mythos. You have credence for something like the saints, right? St. Paul's visions.
Sure, and I mean, I'm right there with you, and I think it can happen in strange ways. I mean, think about in the alien movies that we have many examples of the idea of a small wound, a scoop mark on your body, or a little wound at the base of your neck, as the psychologist says in Don Siegel's Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Who's to say that this isn't, government individuals who are like, we want to plant these ideas around, and then later when we actually do it, and someone comes running through the streets, much like Kevin McCarthy's character says, they're after us, then it's so much easier to dismiss and denounce them as, well, that comes from fiction. You're talking about movies now. It's so much easier for someone to enact a plan that's already been fictionalized and saturated in the culture, because then you can denounce anyone that says they're actually doing that by you saying you watch too many movies, or listen to too much radio, or whatever the case may be. So it's a kind of interesting how it doubles back on itself. It's very noir. It leads to a kind of justified paranoia.
Wow, yeah, that's a great point. Now, in our conversation, you also mentioned the possibility of it being tied into the counterculture, which is a great point, especially with characters like Tim Leary, or
absolutely
counterculture figures that would talk about aliens. Actually, if you read Jay Stevens' book Storming Heaven, which is about LSD and the counterculture.
And I'm definitely not as well versed on this. You can probably take this and run with it, but I read a short account of Leary, and it's interesting to me that Leary began his life as a very conventional person,
right,
who was allegedly abusive to his wife, and his wife committed suicide. And he was admittedly one of the most horrible alcoholics that almost anyone had known. And he, in his first experience, I believe, that was with mushrooms before he actually took out straight up LSD. I could be wrong about that. But whatever of the two it was that he took first, he tied it explicitly to the fact that he's like, I don't drink anymore. So, I mean, if you look at some of the things that Leary says when he's first getting, into these government agencies and doing their bidding, getting, hanging out with Gordon Wasson and whoever else he hung out with.
Right.
The thing that comes out of his mouth more than anything, it's almost like an annoying AA, person who's like, I don't drink anymore. That's my identity. I mean, no offense. I mean, I'm not disparaging or making light of the great things that happen in people's lives when they get off of alcohol. I, of all people, should know that I've had family members, like all of us have, who've gone through that, and
sure,
they're not driving down Main Street with a bottle of Bosco in their hand, so that's got to be good. But nonetheless, we can still critique, the fact that it's this identity of whatever I'm doing right now is part and parcel of my deliverance from demonic alcohol. That seems to be part of Leary's personal psycho.
There's a miraculous conversion that mirrors, like I said, St. Paul, and a lot of these guys would speak in themselves as religious visionaries. I believe it's there's a poem, and this is referenced in Jay Stevens' book, and it's Ginsberg, I think, who reads this poem about being in the midst of his trip, and he sees Molech, and he sees America being a big, huge sacrifice to Molech, right? And it's because they were into shamanism as well. Timothy Leary has a whole book actually on LSD and shamanism, which is all about, it's 100% total occultism. In fact, he was a big, somewhat devotee of Crowley and Crowleyanism and Thelema. I'm not saying that he was actually into the group, but I'm saying that he does reference it quite a bit, and you can find interviews of him where he's sitting under huge images of Jesus as the beast. Actually, there's a interview where he's sitting below an icon, and the icon has Jesus, but has 666 over Jesus's forehead. So very much into this antichrist culture, if we could call it that, right? Where the gurus of the 60s not only saw themselves as counterculture, but also as kind of religious mystic, visionaries.
Sure, and there's the idea behind even Crowley himself, even though it's kind of simplifying his writings. There's an idea in Crowley of taking the husk of the most popular religion, which, is Christianity and its various manifestations in his time in the areas where he lived. But there's a lot of evidence that Crowley was a master of cause and effect, who basically said, look, we need to use, there's something on the lowest level of human existence, societal existence, whatever their religious forms that they're that they're using, yes, we hate them. Yes, they're false. But we don't just discard them and ignore them. We have to use them and sort of invert the meaning of everything that they are. Because it's not because we love Satan. That's why he's not a Satanist strictly, I don't think. But
Right.
he's more, you could call him that and it wouldn't be totally off the mark.
Well,
But
it's
I
a
think
little more Gnostic, I guess.
it's more Gnostic because it's saying there's some kind of an inner form that can be brought to the fore if we take these signifiers and push an opposite sort of content inside the husks of their religious meaning.
Which is what happens. Yeah, which is what happens with that interpretation of the apocalypse, where the apocalypse is given all these alternate meanings.
Oh, absolutely. Then once you start changing the signifiers and changing the terms, and once you get involved in this antinomianism, where you're like, well, here's the label, we might be able to derive some additional oomph if we invert it.
Right.
That's what drives the dialectic forward, right? We invert the meanings in a certain configuration, and we get a magical result. So I think that's why a lot of these cult leaders, whether they know it or not, they're very Crowleyan.
Mm-hmm.
Some are very self-consciously Crowleyan, like you said, Leary, and then also L. Ron Hubbard.
Yes. Yeah, great point. Yeah, there's a great connect there between Leary's interest in Crowley and Hubbard's association. So I'm glad you pointed that out. That's a direct tie-in to the counterculture movement and the alien mythos. Good point.
But the counterculture movement also, it's really odd that, I'm just throwing this out there. I didn't even think about this beforehand, but if you just think, I was listening to a lot of John Lennon songs the other day, solo career, and I was just thinking to myself, isn't it strange that especially in the Midwest where I live, every, 45, 50-year-old, 60-year-old housewife, you can't say anything bad about John Lennon. Even though he says things like, imagine there's no heaven, it's always reinterpreted to be, well, he's just the countercultural damaged goods guy that just, bore the brunt of all our sins. It's just some kind of weird idea about you don't talk bad about John Lennon, and anything he says, oh, well, that's just John Lennon talking about God.
Yes, pop culture and counterculture messianism, right?
Yes, absolutely. And it's weird, like the whole, gathering together in Times Square and crying together. Now, don't get me wrong, I do understand all the, the music touches their lives, and a lot of it's on a very superficial level. But once you do open up the Pandora's box of, well, what's this guy really talking about, and what was he really into? People are not really happy about it. I mean, I know why, but I'm just saying that I think it's my own personality which says, I can debunk something and still enjoy it, and I think that doesn't. Yeah, that might be more Crowley-esque than I imagine, but some people just want to keep their entertainment in the same box as their religion and just be like, don't mess with that. I enjoy that,
Yeah, and there's connections with the Beatles as well. Crowley is on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's album, and the Beatles were interested in Transcendental Meditation and Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and all that, which is kind of, as I understand, into the 70s and 80s was housed at, is it Mentmore? Mentmore Estate. It's the estate that's used in Eyes Wide Shut.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that actual estate. I may be getting it mixed up. The films are kind of run together, but it's the same. It's whatever estate. It's also Bruce Wayne's manor in the new Christian Bale Batman films. That estate was for a while the home of the Transcendental Meditation Center, and that was located in England. So from there, it was then sold off, and David Lynch, who is part of TM, Transcendental Meditation, had a big stake in that at some point, and still does in terms of the Transcendental Meditation or the Lynch Foundation. But now, the reason I bring up John Lennon is that I have just a theory. It's not totally fleshed out, but I wonder. I do tend to lean towards the thesis that he was assassinated because of counterculture reasons that were not completely amenable to the desires of particularly the military-industrial complex, and that's what I think we see with JFK, RFK, MLK, and John Lennon. That does not mean that these, in my view, are good characters, right? You can be offed even if you're a stooge. which is what we've seen the CIA do in many black operations with puppet dictators, right? I mean, Saddam was installed by the U.S. and was trained by the CIA. This is public information now, mainstream news, and then later deposed. So, just because you serve the system doesn't mean that you can't later be deposed. And I see it in the same way with some of the Beatles. I think Lennon was taken out. I think that Mark David Chapman was used in that operation. He was, in some degree, either just schizophrenic or mind control patsy of some. I think that's possible. And it was an operation to get rid of John Lennon, either to make him a martyr, or, this is the more interesting thesis, it seems that John Lennon might actually have kind of been waking up to things. And I'm not at all trying to lionize him as a hero. I deplore his communism and Marxism that he promoted in songs like Imagine and all that. But there's an interesting clip on YouTube where he's being interviewed on British television. I don't know if you've seen it. And he starts talking about how the plan is to actually create a new world order and depopulate the earth. And he's very explicit about it. He says, "Oh yeah, man, they're going to depopulate the earth, man. Don't you know? Don't you know that's the plan? They want to get rid of everybody." And it's like a year or two after this, on this big BBC television show, that he's dead. And I'm not saying that that's certain. I'm just saying it's interesting, right? I mean, I could see, you've got people. This was back in the 70s when he's saying this. And you can't have pop culture figures criticizing depopulation. That's a no-no. So, I wonder if there wasn't some element of John Lennon stepping outside the bounds of what the establishment wanted.
It wouldn't surprise me at all. It always gets my attention whenever we're talking about Beatles and post-Beatles pop music, because I do believe it's incontestable that when the Beatles, especially when they did things like Sgt. Pepper, it opened up an area where, oh wow, so popular music is music to be listened to and talked about now. Mm-hmm. And every song and every album since then has to have a message in it, or else it's just pabulum. It's not real music. And that leads a lot of very untalented people with a lot less talent than the Beatles to try to sort of overreach their capacity and to make a great statement. But hey, there is a band that does actually self-consciously was created to be a vehicle to tell an occult alien tale, and that was Blue Oyster Cult.
Oh wow, okay.
Who they were formed by two rock critics, Sandy Pearlman and Richard Meltzer, who said, we need a band because Sandy Pearlman wrote a series of poems called The Soft Doctrines of Imaginos. And the whole idea of these poems, which were later made into mini songs and then a concept album called Imaginos, the whole idea was that there are these alien visitors who planted human life here. And it's a pretty familiar story, but it's got some interesting twists. And the whole idea is all these famous people throughout history have been different incarnations of Imaginos, who becomes more and more conscious of his role as he is reincarnated. And the whole idea...
Here's the old Avatar story.
Oh, yeah. And he even does the Dr. John Dee thing where he says, well, this conquistador got this in the 1800s or sometime like that, or much before, I suppose, found this obsidian mirror in an Incan temple and took it to his grandmother's house in Cornwall, and it sat there poisoning the earth, poisoning the society for years until World War I was the inevitable result of it. But anyway, so it's an obsidian mirror of death that's set in somebody's granny's attic, and it was just poisoning the atmosphere for all those years. But then he talks about Dr. John Dee and some of the songs that Sandy Pearlman wrote, the lyrics. One is Extraterrestrial Intelligence, ETI, which I never understood the lyrics to some of that song until I did this ufological research. And there's a line in the song that talks about when prophecy fails, and I read about that book this week. There's a book called When Prophecy Fails, where these sociologists studied this UFO cult. It was a lady named Donna something or other, and she didn't even really have a name for her group, but they predicted this UFO was going to come on a particular day, and then it didn't happen, of course. And then they had to adjust their theology to accommodate the failure of the UFO to appear. So when prophecy fails, it has a lot more meaning to me now in those lyrics. But the lyrics to ETI, extraterrestrial intelligence, also talk about three men in black said, "Don't report this," as if they're the three wise men, you know.
Wow.
And then the "Don't report this" is actually a chapter heading in Jacques Vallée's book, The Invisible College, which talks about, he did a study of UFO reports.
Yes.
So as I was looking through all this stuff, I'm like, where have I heard all this stuff before? And it's like, oh, my Agents of Fortune album, you know, the Blue Oyster Cult. So it's interesting that this stuff, and people that are into the Blue Oyster Cult, I mean, they're totally like, they will go onto the verge of saying it's all true. It's kind of like you said about...
Well, the Blue Oyster Cult is a cult.
Yeah, even though it's fictional, all the more
Right.
reason for, especially Midwestern music fans with absolutely no excitement in their life, you know, they're going to have to say, no, it's real.
Yeah.
You know? So, very bizarre stuff, but...
Well, that reminds me, too, of, do you remember the 90s alternative band Hum?
How do you spell it?
H-U-M?
No, I don't, but...
She thinks she's missed the train to Mars. She's out back counting stars. Anyway, minor hit back in 96 or 7. That is an interesting song about UFO cult, too. So, something to check out.
What was their story? Just an anonymous...
You know, I never did read too deep into it. I just saw an article years ago talking about the meaning of that song. And, you know, I never really paid a whole lot of attention to the lyrics. I liked the song back, you know, my high school days. And then saw that article and I started thinking, oh, yeah, well, that's, you know, she's actually writing numbers down on a piece of paper that are the coordinates, and she thinks she's been visited by aliens. And, you know, I don't know if this guy, you know, maybe the lead singer was dating some chick who had a bad trip and thought that she was visited. Well, I don't know, but it's just a neat, side note tie-in to what you were talking about. Made me think about UFOs and rock music.
What better way to get into those inaccessible teenage bedrooms of you know, boys than to get into their record collection, you know?
Now, you mentioned something else, too, that made me think. Well, let's talk about what these cults tend to do is offer a grand metaphysical narrative. You know, they purport to give kind of an explanation of everything. And we saw that especially with Scientology, where Hubbard, you know, has a book or a lecture on pretty much everything, right? Yeah. At some point, he covers it all. We cover all the bases here. And you have done a lot of work on ancient philosophy, and we deal with philosophy quite a bit here at JaysAnalysis. So I'd like to plumb your mind a bit on the pre-Socratics and the Aperon, the boundless, and maybe get into some of what we discussed on Esoteric Hollywood about how the pre-Socratics thought that, or early on at least, that there was this idea that matter had its own inherent force of consumption. So yeah. Why might the pre-Socratics relate to these crazy alien topics?
Yes, well, there are a lot of ways of answering that, but the best way, I think, is the reason why early Greek philosophy, which is the earliest philosophy, normally it's considered that, is, well, you can look at the work of Peter Kingsley,
yeah,
who Peter Kingsley says, well, wait a minute, let's go back to Parmenides and Empedocles. These are shamans, basically. Now, I don't know if I would go that far, but one thing that is true is that these early Greek philosophers, a lot of times they deal with religious concepts, and they seem to be religious practitioners. So they're not just these guys that are like, woke up one fine day and said, you know what, I'm tired of these traditional tribal, you know, Hellenistic worldviews. Let's just start being hardcore scientists now. You know, it certainly doesn't seem to have happened that way. I mean, if you look at the works of Plato, it's obvious there's religion all over the place. Pagan religion, of course, but if you look at the Anaximander, the first, or one of the earliest of the Greek philosophers, you know, he talks about the apeiron. Everything came to be. He answers the question, how did the cosmos in its ordered manner with human society, you know, animals out there, minerals and planets. How did this all come to be? He says two things, and this is my main point, is that there seems to be two themes that kind of clash with each other in esotericism, and we find these in the early Greek philosophy, and that is the idea of balance, and then the idea of ascension is what I call it, or advancement, or whatever. And so the idea in Anaximander, the idea of balance is reflected in his idea that, look, yes, things change, the seasons change, but you just have these opposing forces like heat and cold, light and day, dry and wet, these kind of abstract elements. Ta onta in Greek is what he called them. Mm-hmm. And these elements, they take turns, just like different families in the Greek polis are like, well, you're elected to be in charge now, but only for a certain time, and then you have to step down and let the other elected representatives take your place for a while. There's an analogy, I think, between that and the idea that, yes, there's order. The same thing happens, but in a sequence. So you have the seasons, you have reigns of kings, you have regimes, you have long-term climate change, which they actually talked about, the pre-Socratics did. So there's order in change. So that's the balance theme. But how did all these elements even come to be? That question kind of looms. And the more you concentrate on the balance side of things, the more the ascension type theme gets out of focus, which is, where did the elements themselves come from? And that question is at the center of the pre-Socratics. It's a religious type question. The answer they come to is bizarre. It's the apeiron, the unbounded reality. It's whatever, and basically what the apeiron is, it literally means the unbounded, the illimitable, what you can't walk across. It's too big to walk from one side or the other to it. And what the apeiron is every potential possibility. It's matter, too. It's actually a spatial reality. But it's not a space that you can specify anything about, because it has every potential thing that's ever going to exist in it, interpenetrated with its opposite. We talked about those opposite elements, qualities, and properties. Right. Those all exist everywhere at once and in every way. So it's kind of pure potentiality. It's the philosopher's stone, really. It's what the alchemists are trying to get back to. It's to run the process of creation backwards so that you can start from the beginning, the apeiron, and then you can start determining parts of it so that you can create whatever you want.
So it's sort of to re-engineer it as a technology.
Yeah, in this, and so you have those two themes of ascension and balance, but I didn't talk about the third theme, which gives us more concrete content to it, and maybe more idea about like the child abduction and the child abuse. Is it seems that the early, if you look at the pre-Socratic philosophers and then the early medical writers, the Galenic corpus and what came before it, you see that ancient Greek medical writers said, look, everything that has life, everything that exists, has the same principles of development. It begins as a gonemon, a seed, and then it develops by its own natural power. It develops into whatever is in that seed, and it develops according to the same way that a human fetus or an animal fetus develops in an amniotic sac.
Well, this sounds like the morphology of Darwinianism.
Oh, absolutely. And it's also, though, the apeiron is the same way. It also is kind of like, it's a soup, which is anytime it wants to move, it's kind of like...
It's the primordial pea soup.
It's the blob. I mean, it's the goo that's in all the science fiction movies, because it could be anything. It corrodes everything and breaks everything down to just sheer simplicity.
Now, would you say this is distinct from prima materia?
I think it's the same thing. It's just different ideas of the people who are looking at it.
Oh, okay.
If I want prima materia, I'm an alchemist who's saying, I want to engineer this thing. Mm-hmm. If I'm talking about the apeiron, I'm paying attention to the fact that it precedes everything.
Oh, okay.
It's sort of the basis. It's the potentia that's behind everything that's actually been manifested. So yeah, they're the same thing, I think.
Right.
But I think they're just two different viewpoints of it. But it's interesting that if the medical thinkers say, oh, but it's always the fetus is the paradigm for all development of the cosmos as a whole too. So that may tie into the whole star child thing.
Yes, the seminal seed that grows into the telos, right?
Yeah, and it begins as this undifferentiated soup, mm-hmm. But there's the idea in the Orphic cosmogonies, which are some of the early writers that influenced Plato and others. That's a third text. They talk about this kind of darkness out of which light shines, and it's like a sea of light. So it's like water light.
Yeah, they also pay homage to the sun serpent.
Mm-hmm.
The Orphic mysteries ultimately kind of have a conflation of the ultimate principle being a kind of sun serpent, as well as, I'm trying to remember, there's a great scholarly essay by Hans Leisegang on this that I've referenced quite a few times.
Yeah, Leisegang. I've read that one. I know
Okay.
what you're talking about. It's called it's about the serpent that bites its tail.
Yes.
Is the title of it, but I don't know. I can't recall the Ouroboros.
Mm-hmm.
I think that may be the title of it. I don't know. But at any rate, yeah, the idea in the Orphic cosmogony, which may just reflect general religious ideas which are just, put into the poem.
Mm-hmm.
But what it seems to say is that you start with this soup, and then there's a hardening, there's a scissioning, a cutting off of part of this light water, this luminous water, into, oh, well, here's this section. And how are we going to scission it off? Well, we're going to have a hardening of the water on the exterior, which becomes a shell, like a serpent's egg.
Yeah, this is where we get the egg of the cosmos, right?
And so the whole idea of the Greek philosophical notion of creation is, well, you have to have a kind of amniotic sac which contains, it has to differentiate part of the illimitable so that you can have definition, so you can have something that's actually manifested and not just unmanifest. So the problem is that this is always seen as being a child, a human-type child.
So, 2001.
Sure, and keep in mind, the way that the ancient Greeks thought of, and this goes through the Renaissance too, the way they thought of perception in light is that it's an actual physical impinging
Right.
on your body, all the way down into your chest. So what happens is, if you're looking at light, it's little. If you're looking at the sun, there are these little simulacra, these little material specks that imitate the whole sun are actually pressing themselves on your eye,
Right.
going down the optic nerve and into your heart or soul, or the set of tubes that carry the pneuma throughout your body. So I mean, it seems that it's kind of easy to see how these alien abduction narratives that are like, well, I don't know why they're pressing all these things into every way they can into my body, but I'm sure it's for the best. It's interesting. And then also just the social theorist Lawrence Birkin says the last frontier of societal taboo is ageism, meaning the old and the young, and their ability or their freedom to do as they want, and for us to do what we want to them. So that may be overstating things, but it certainly is interesting that it all began with the idea that anything that has any kind of growth or any kind of organic reality to it is just a baby in a womb.
Now, are you talking about the idea of like euthanasia? Is that what you're saying? Like,
well, no, I think.
what do you when you say that the last stage is the young and the old? What do you mean?
Well, basically, age of consent is what I'm talking about.
Oh, you're talking about pedo stuff.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
A little too You can't be too euphemistic, I guess.
Well, at the same time as that kind of stuff comes also the idea that the state can also determine when you're no longer a person, when you're no longer
yes.
useful to the social order, which, if you've seen Logan's Run, this is kind of the setup of the technocracy in Logan's Run, where when you hit 30, it's time to go to the great ballet where you get incinerated.
Yeah, and you know what it just reminded me of? I'm sure we'll talk about it later, but Solaris.
Yeah.
Because if there's only one type of generation, one type of growth, this esoteric, subconscious idea of the baby and the amniotic water, luminous water, then if God, man, and cosmos come into being as a fetus in an amniotic sac, then also your own thoughts are no exception. Especially since your perception, the cells in your body are constantly giving off physical simulacra in every direction. So your thoughts become persons, like in Solaris. He emanates, memories, which become persons. And then those beings, it's a question of, do they also emanate their own dreams or ideas of themselves into reality? And then Chris Kelvin doesn't want children, so he he, or at least his wife thinks that he doesn't. So she aborts a baby, and he's a hardcore Darwinist, so he's making fun of any kind of religion or any kind of higher value at a dinner party. So it all kind of comes together to me to show that there's a theme of, okay, if there's one type of generation, then I can't exempt myself from it as much as I would like to. And my thoughts, just as God's thoughts or the higher power's thoughts become realities, then mine also do as well. And then when I want to deny that and throw the girl in a spaceship and make it take off, they just come back. So there's a strange kind of, to me, it's like there's a confusion of categories where it's like that the planet Solaris brings to the fore.
Well, let's get into that. Tell me, did you want to talk the Tarkovsky version, or did you want to talk Soderbergh, or both?
Soderbergh, because I've seen the first half of the Tarkovsky, and I'll probably have to, at a separate setting, see the second half of it, because it's very, as you mentioned in private conversation, it's hard to get through. But
okay, well, let's get into Solaris. So yeah, I feel similarly about this film. I remember seeing it when it came out, and then recently repurchasing it, and was not well received by audiences. It was a bit boring. But it is philosophical. It is making some interesting points. So let's take off from there. What are your impressions of this? Because it does fit into the alien mythos, although it's not aliens in the way that we typically think of alien invaders from Mars.
Sure. The Dr. Chris Kelvin is commissioned or asked to go to the space station that's orbiting this planet Solaris, and the planet, what it seems to do is the human beings that are orbiting it in the spaceship, whatever their memories are, whatever they're thinking about, whatever their conflicts are, actually the planet brings these to the surface and creates physical humans that are indistinguishable, just like the body snatchers, except they do have emotions. And like the android in Blade Runner, Chris Kelvin's wife, the similar Lakeram or whatever of her, says, I know that I'm not a real human being, and I know that these thoughts that I have, the set of options I have for thinking are limited to what your memories are. So I have some freedom. I can choose which of your thoughts of me I want to embody at this moment, but it makes me sad that I can't be like you and just choose my own memories. But then again, it leads us to the question, but is Kelvin any different? Doesn't he have to live with the ineradicable fact that his wife committed suicide because he walked out on her because she had the abortion done? So it all, just like 2001. And hey, both Solarises, I've read this very self-consciously looking at 2001, saying, okay, well, here's my 2001, even though it's totally different, yet, okay, we're going to put the budget and we're going to do the, the one guy's going to go fix the problem, So what
you're saying is that, what exactly are you saying in terms of that question of reality? Like, in other words, are you back to like a Maya thing, that it's all illusory, or that because of it's all just a deterministic process, then the perception of deterministic natural process, the perception that we're actually conscious is just as meaningless as the phantasm of some magical planet that brings these memories to life? Is that what you're saying?
What I think it is this. I think that operating as it does, the plot under this esoteric paradigm of, all things are created. They have this theme of balance, but then there's also the theme of it all comes from this undifferentiated origin. I think that Solaris kind of represents the unpredictable other that exists, even though Kelvin would like to
so like the monolith.
Yeah, so like Kelvin would like to think of himself as, even though he probably consciously would never put it this way, but he'd like to think of himself as being totally in control, being the scientist and all this stuff, but actually he's not, because his memories that have no scientific, his emotions that have no scientific value, they're actually taking on physical form. And not only that, but the psychoses and neuroses that his little memory people are having are hard to distinguish from his own uncertainties. So
I see.
I think it's kind of like one of those ironies in movies where it's like, you're not real, but I can't tell you from what's not real, and you're showing me what's really going on with me, showing me that how can I uphold myself as real at that point?
Yeah,
Perhaps I
exactly.
am.
So yeah, which is kind of the presumption of scientism, of radical materialism and reductionism, is that presumes to say what's real, and then the great irony and contradiction of that is that it also negates the possibility of consciousness and the self-existing person and existence of the existence of the self over time. In other words, to negate reality in that fashion also includes the negation of the self, which was the very supposed being that is trying to posit reality being negated. Do you follow me?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's the whole thing, is that where does, who are the sort of prophets of modern science? If we look at Rene Descartes, his whole idea that, well, the mind has absolutely no spatial content whatsoever. Locke said the same thing, There's no space to it whatsoever, and it's totally immune from any of the kind of corrosion or weirdness that all other beings or existent things have to deal with. So it's just kind of like, don't worry about it, because it's taken care of. You can't say it's here, you can't step on it, you can't do this, but we just know it's there, and we're not going to talk about it anymore. And of course, the thing is with modern scientific ideas, it's kind of like, here's how I look at it. Just take an example, biological psychology, which became a big deal, especially after Freudianism became discredited big time. So biological psychology, especially in the 1980s when we came up with these brain scans, which pushed computers in a way to the next level. It affected all computerized technology. But the whole brain scan idea is, okay, well, there's oxygen moving in time in this portion of the brain. So there must be blood that goes along with it. Therefore, that must be an active part of the brain when you're doing this or that or having this experience. Now, there is a lot of presuppositions that are hidden below all that stuff. But they've built everything about brain science that we know has been built on that shaky foundation. Just the supposition that because blood's flowing somewhere, that this part of the brain has something to do with love, hate, anger, whatever. Perhaps it does, but what? And is that the only factor? It's the monocausal fallacy as well. So, I mean, and if you look at what psychologists do on a day-to-day basis today, where it's like, well, we're going to look at babies and see if they look an extra second when you're making this kind of face, well, then that means something about their psyche. And it's like, well, maybe they just looked for another second. It's funny that if you ask those basic questions, the whole research paradigm just falls flat on its face.
Yeah, that's because it's all based on the idea that there are neutral, brutally neutral facts in the world. The facts are a part of some sort of interpretive grid or matrix or schema or framework, right? That's the whole basis of Enlightenment, tabula rasa thinking, that you can just approach these objects in the lab setting or in the scientific testing setting of whatever form or fashion, and you can just blankly and just bold-faced, bare bones read the object and read it correctly and without any prior meaning or interpretive narrative or interpretive framework. And that's just simply not true about human psychology at all. It's completely impossible. It's humanly impossible. If you go into the lab and you try to understand the earthworm, it's absolutely impossible to understand this object apart from all your previous thoughts and interactions and beliefs about earthworms.
Right.
And that's why that brings down the whole, it's, I believe, accurately called the myth of neutrality, that you can neutrally approach objects in the world without prior presuppositions or assumptions.
And it's interesting that in Solaris, how do we move that onto that? Well, Kelvin is just having a dinner party with his uppity, snooty scientific friends. His wife, who he doesn't know is pregnant, she's like, well, how can people, don't you believe in emotion and any value to our actions? No, it's all mathematical, a bunch of series of zeros.
That's exactly what I was about to say. So the next step in that process is quantification. Oh, well, yes, I can eliminate my previous assumptions about what an earthworm is and how it operates by simply reducing it to math, reducing it to quantity. So I have 7 earthworms, and 7 earthworms that are 7 inches long, and they live 17 days and 7, But the problem is that the people who, in the scientific frame of mind, all moved in that direction, all eventually lost that argument, right? Because that's ultimately what Bertrand Russell says. Bertrand Russell says, I can just quantify everything and interpret it as mathematics, 1s and 0s and 2s and 3s. That way it eliminates any possible subjectivism of how I feel about the earthworm or what I mistakenly read into the earthworm. I can just translate it into numbers, facts, and figures, and those can't be wrong, or they are less susceptible to being wrong. And the problem is that Kurt Gödel showed you that even when you try to do that, you still need some frame in terms of set theory to reference outside of number systems. So in other words, you can't have a completely isomorphic numerical reading of everything. It doesn't work.
It's like the set of 7 earthworms.
Yeah, and then the problem is that sets also refer outside of themselves to other objects.
Yeah. Plus, what's
the set,
7?
like the set of sets, right?
What's the concept of 7? What are 7 objects laying side by side? There has to be a different order of reality that says, well, there's a concept of 7 which holds if you have 7 dots of sand, 7
Yes.
atoms,
One of the
7
many, right?
planets. It definitely. And many scientists are aware of this. If you talk to most scientists, they're just going to be like, yeah, I know, but I'm just doing this research program. It's
Exactly.
They're like, I'm not trying to make any great metaphysical claims. I'm embarrassed by the books that come out on the New York Times bestseller list. So, I mean, you do have a lot of people who just shrug your shoulders and go, look, I just put this process through here. It's the vocal minority of true believers who make themselves look bad. But at any rate, with Solaris, we have Clooney's character, Chris Kelvin, indirectly. So it's almost like you can say scientifically, did he cause the death of his own son? He didn't know his son was alive.
Right.
Or child, I should say. I shouldn't assume it was the son. But, she sort of cast her attention and cast her actions toward saying, okay, well, if everything is reduced to cosmic dust that's just flying together in a certain way, well, then it doesn't matter whether or not we have this child. You're not going to care about it.
Absolutely.
And so therefore, I'm just going to go ahead and abort it. And then he finds out and leaves her. She kills herself. So it's just very interesting that it all has to do with reproduction and generation, which is that occult theme I was talking about.
Yes, the general principle, right?
The fate of the fetus and all that stuff. And then when you get to Star Child in 2001, it's the cosmic fetus. You get the literalization of that metaphor. What is your interpretation of the Star Child? I'd like to hear about that.
In much the same fashion, I read it as just the emergent deity, the Deus Ex Machina that arises from within the cosmos, and that possibly there's a kind of alchemical way that you can read that, and a classic Hermetic way of reading it, and then there's also the fact that I've kind of revised my interpretation of 2001, because when I saw it and wrote a kind of crappy piece about 6 years ago, and I rewatched it, and I got the impression that actually when Bowman removes the batteries or floppy disks or whatever that shuts down HAL, that's actually what triggers the message to come on that tells him to go after the monolith. Right. The message comes on the screen after he shuts HAL down and says, oh, by the way, your secret space mission, the secret space program wants you to follow the monolith. That's why you're there. So Bowman didn't actually know that. Bowman goes ahead with the mission and ends up going through the Tesseract with the monolith, or into the monolith, however you want to picture it. Then we have the Victorian, or the French hotel setting, and then this leads to him entering the monolith as an old man and becoming Star Child. What I read that as is the eternal return, just a continual cycle, but that I think that the AI was actually the key to it all along, right? In other words, the HAL is kind of a higher form of created ordered and logical process. And if you recall the conversation that Hal keeps having before he's shut down, he keeps saying that humans are error. Humans are an error. I don't make errors. And so then he essentially wants to delete humans. And if you go into the later Clark stories, Hal is correct, because Starchild nukes the planet. And so this is a kind of radical start over narrative, right, where man, through the use of AI, achieves apotheosis. Well, I guess just Bowman does, as kind of the ultimate Ubermensch, and nukes the planet to start it over. So it's just a eternal recurrence. That's the Ouroboros. Man becomes God, and then the process starts all over again. And you said, as you pointed out, in the insemination mythos narrative, but it's the AI that it's transhumanism. But whereas I previously didn't read it as that, I previously read it as, it's man versus robot to see who's going to go to the next level. But I don't think so. I actually think the monolith itself is kind of supposed to be AI, because in the original narrative, as I wrote in my 2001 piece, the story was supposed to be that it's a TV screen instructor. It's kind of like a robot TV screen instructor that comes in. It was actually going to beam messages of the apes. It was going to teach the apes how to create tech. So.
What about the name of Bowman? To me, it comes to mind, it could be an Ouroboros thing, like how the wood of the bow like bends back toward itself.
Yeah, because he's shot out into the furthest reach of Jupiter and beyond.
Plus the rainbow with its 7 colors and the 7 planets.
Yes, and you see the 7 diamonds in the abyss, crossing the abyss sequence, correct? Which I connected with, which I connected with the 7 planetary spheres and deities, planets.
Definitely. And
it's interesting too that they're diamonds, because diamonds are boxes turned on their point, and the boxes are the monolith is a box, and space and time is a box in the 6 cardinal directions.
Right. And one thing I failed to mention back when we were talking about L. Ron Hubbard in his R6. What could the R6... I never speculated about what the R6 could be. Well, I think it's 6 directions. It's space-time.
Wow.
And in the R, what could the R be? I never quite... reality, it could be the real, it could be anything. I mean, we have no way of determining that. He never said. But it's interesting to speculate about, what is it about 6? Why wouldn't it be 7? Well, 7 would be, perfection.
Perfection. Yeah.
6 is bad. So
I have a question for you in regard to Hubbard that it came up over the weekend with. I spent a good bit of time discussing with former Secretary Catherine Austin Fitts at the lecture, who knows quite a bit about government and finance and black budgets and black markets and all that. That was kind of her focus when she was in the Bush administration. And she pointed out something I'd never heard, that there is, I think, a 10-part series of Hubbard's, and it may be one of those Battlefield Earth novels. I have no idea. I've not read any of his science fiction novels, but she said that in this 10-part series, there's actually an extended kind of analogy of aliens running black markets and drugs that is kind of curiously close to how governments actually do it.
Wow.
So I don't know if you came across any of that in your...
That sounds like Battleship Earth. I just read synopses of it, which didn't really mention anything like that, but from what I know of it, it could have happened in Battleship Earth.
Okay.
Which was like a 10-volume thing. A very massive book.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you that before I forgot about it. I didn't mean to change the subject.
Oh, no. I'll talk about Hubbard all day long. I love talking about that stuff.
And so that's what we're getting then in most of these. Do you think that this kind of seems to be really the only option for where all these kind of perennial pagan, traditional, hermetic perspectives always fall back into this? I mean, it makes me think of Aldous Huxley's Perennial Philosophy, which is a book where he gives his presentation of perennialism, and it's everything that you've just talked about, right? He falls back on all of this stuff. even in Eyeless in Gaza, if I recall in that novel, he discusses that as is this sort of so-called counterculture figure, which he's actually completely part of the establishment, he talks like he actually believes in demons. I mean, I realize that it's a novel, but I've seen other quotes as well as in perennial philosophy where he kind of talks about, gods are real. I've interacted with them when I'm tripping, and, this stuff's real. You're not going to get it, you bunch of dummies.
Right. No, I get that too. And I think that it is, if the question is posed, where does all this mythology come from? Well, I'm not entirely sure, but I think that at least with the Greek example, with the elements, you have the principle of water, which is fluidity and change. But I think earth is stability, relative stability. So if you want to have a life form, you're going to have a pod and what's in it. So you're going to have earth and water. And, of course, fire can change the form of water into mud. It can dry out, and then you have air. Well, air to me is the strange one, but I think that if you look at Hesiod's cosmogony, or I think that's the poem, where basically there wouldn't be anything in the world. It says at one point in the poem, Kronos wanted to hold back all his children out of the light, a cruel thing to do. Mm-hmm. But you had to have one of the sons that cut off the proud member of the father to the water. Zeus, cut off Kronos' manhood, if you will, and but also that cutting. If you look at Kronos himself, used his scythe to cut heaven and earth, his mother and father, and that's what allowed Zeus and the pantheon of gods to be born. It all begins with rape, which allows no space. It all begins with heaven laying down on top of Gaia without any interval, and Kronos cuts the space, which allows light to exist. It allows it's sort of like an amniotic sac, but instead of water, you have air, and it allows the beings to exist in the light. To me, that means that it allows the beings to have their own integrity as beings.
Right.
My body doesn't fuse and scatter and smear into the molecules of some other body, and to the point that it loses its own boundedness. But I think if we translate these kinds of themes, they're just really general, and that's good. I mean, that's what makes them pop up all over the place. I don't think we need I think it's just a similar brain structure, and I'm not going to be a reductionist here. I mean, I do believe there's a spiritual element to it as well. How could I not, being a theist? But I do think that this whole idea of I think these mythologies reflect things that we have to have, things we value in society.
Yeah, that's true, but what I'm thinking, though, is that it reminds me of the Sherrard piece that you sent me some years ago, Tradition and the Traditions, where when questioned, I think by Friedhof Schuon or one of the perennialists, his response was to the question of, well, how do you know which tradition is the correct tradition when you haven't existentially experienced all the other traditions like Hinduism or whatever? Right. And I think Sherrard gave an excellent sort of presuppositional response by saying, well, I can boil down what the starting point principles are for the competing traditions, and what you tend to see across the board in the perennial groups, whether it's Hinduism or Sufism or any ancient mythology or any of the different approaches, you see that the starting point is an impersonal, abstracted concept, force, number, boundlessness, right? Uh-huh. And the emanation or the explosion into multiplicity or the Big Bang, whatever way you want to characterize it, it is not done as an intentional creative act. It's done as this accidental mistake / just sort of happening. It just shit just happened.
Yeah.
And it's an impersonal natural process.
Absolutely.
And that's what distinguishes the notion of a personal God and a creation.
Right. And in the ancient Greek one, I mean, the apeiron, the category of person, is certainly not manifest there. And I think that's why, in my interpretation, when we have these narratives in popular culture like Solaris, where you have someone who wants to have order, Chris Kelvin, and yet he also wants to have ascension. He wants to have, he wants to be fulfilled in himself. He's not happy with his wife because she won't publish her paper. Her wife says, Kelvin's wife says, I don't think anyone's going to recognize what I'm trying to say. And he's like, so you don't care about anyone's opinion but yourself. So he doesn't like the fact that she's closed off in herself, like a one that hasn't emanated anything. And yet he, is pontificating about all this reductionist science, and she just acts out, almost like a Dostoevsky novel. She acts out the lies that he's saying. And it's in the context of this, you've got our little, $200 meal here, $200 plates that we're eating here. And with my colleagues, we're talking shop. And it seems very innocuous, but it actually leads to murder of the child, the worst crime. So it's in the suicide, the denial of God's canon against self-slaughter, as Hamlet says. So it leads to all the things we would find in a Greek tragedy, simply because I think him following this scientific way of thinking ironically mirrors, and I think that's what you're getting at, it ironically mirrors this occult ancient Greek philosophy, which doesn't begin with a personal God. It begins with something that's absolutely physical. The apeiron is not beyond everything, just like the UFOs and the Christs of the cults that say, oh, well, they're imminently physical. It's totally imminent. Likewise, the apeiron is just something you can't run from one side or the other to. And this is where philosophy begins. Plato talks about this. Aristotle categorizes all these ideas of the apeiron and says, well, here's this guy's idea, here's that guy's idea, but he doesn't discard it. It becomes kind of the unspoken background of Western thought. And then Christianity just gets assimilated to it, I would argue, in the West.
Especially in the Roman tradition, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And so I guess the point of this is that there are all kinds of consequences for a plurality of independent beings that come from a personal God. Well, it wreaks havoc in this apeironic, if you want to call it that, tradition, where you don't have a clearly delineated individual. You just have the apeiron and its emanations. Well,
yes, exactly.
Am I supposed to? Okay, we'll look at the ascension theme. So I'm a piece of matter out here, and my birth mirrors that of the cosmos, and thus, in a sense, of the apeiron. Okay, so how do I accommodate for other individuals who are supposed to do this? Well, that's where the balance theme would come in. But how does it help me to think that there are going to be summer and all these different phases chronologically? It doesn't help, or it doesn't.
Well, it also seems to logically follow that I should be like Starchild and nuke the rest of the planet because I'm going to be the god. We can't have a bunch of competing gods. We'll be right back at the Olympian council and raping and pillaging each other.
That's exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying that the two ideals of order or balance and ascension are incompatible, ultimately. But I think that we don't want to discount it and say, well, that's stupid. It's not so much that it's stupid. I think that it embodies a kind of dilemma in all cultural realities, which is it's the desire to have something transcendent which says this is what you should do. Because if you don't do that, you can just go to your room and have the abortion. Mm-hmm. If that's what you want to do at that moment, and no one can tell you any otherwise. But we also want to have the order where it's like, well, we don't want one individual to be in control here, and so that your whim becomes everyone else's law. Right. So I think this is embodied, interestingly, it has all kinds of theological implications, which when we get to the scientific part are just swept aside as if they're funny to even talk about it. Just like that conversation Clooney's having. Right. Where it's just scoffed at.
Right.
But anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying something that probably could have been stated in about.
No, that's great. That's great, but I think we're going to come to the close of this talk here. Any other final points you want to leave us with?
No, I think it built up to a nice little crescendo there, so I'm good with it.
Okay. All right. Thank you for listening to Jay's Analysis Podcast, and this was, of course, James Kelley. James is the proprietor of romeosign.wordpress.com, which I will link for private subscribers. And we will return next week